Hello and welcome to Perspectives. My name is David Schoneman. I'm your host on this program. On Perspectives, we'd like to take a look at what's going on in the city and in the state particularly, sometimes on national level too, that affects life here in Nashua, New Hampshire. So today we're going to take a look at some legislation that's coming before the House and ultimately the Senate up in Concord that will affect the way that we live here in Nashua. I'm in the studio today with Laurie Ortolano, who I've had on the show before, and she's a champion of right to know and public access to government activity. We need to know what our government is doing because it affects us. And right now we've been dealing with a lot of secrecy, really, coming out of City Hall. We're going to talk about that today. Laurie, thanks for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
Glad to have you here again. So, we've been here before. We've talked about your crusade, and it's a noble crusade. It's a good crusade because people at home should know what their government's doing. We can't just wait to read the newspaper or see what our tax bill is. We should know what is happening.
Yes.
And you've had a lot of questions over the last several years.
Yes.
And you've met with a lot of stonewalling activity out of City Hall.
Yes.
And it looks like there might be some more stonewalling activity coming out in the form of legislation that's coming before the House up in Concord.
Yes.
We have House Bill HB 1002. Tell us, what is that all about? You know, all these numbers, HB this, HB that, people don't know. And I think that there's some intentional obfuscation there. HB 1002. Oh, you don't need to know about that. Right? Don't pay attention to that.
There was a little bit of that going on, actually. It's kind of funny that's true. That, you know, we were, Right to Know New Hampshire was a little late to the party to weigh in on it, but we were not. Our president was right there in the forefront when that bill popped up to give input as well as the media. So what it is, it's a piece of legislation that permits municipalities to adopt a policy to charge up to $25 an hour to fulfill requests that require more than 10 hours of a city's time within a month. So, and you know, when you sit back on its face value, you might think, well, that's not so bad. But the whole process of how that accounting is going to be done, how the kind of dialogue that's happening between the requester and the city or the town to minimize the burden and understand how the records exist so that you can get what you want without wasting a lot of people's resources becomes very important. And for cities like Nashua that I think do a lot of hiding, they are going to use this as a weapon to keep us from getting information by making costs to get that information very, very high.
It's clear that the city of Nashua does use things as weapons.
Definitely.
You were arrested.
Yes.
They used the police department as a weapon of intimidation.
They did.
You've been stonewalled. They use stonewalling as a weapon to prevent you from getting, or any citizen, from getting information. They have a pattern of using legislation, using rules as weapons. And here's another rule that I'm sure is the city of Nashua behind
backing
this?
It. Sure, they're a backer. You know, it's interesting. They conducted this, had its genesis in the House Judiciary Committee. And it was sponsored through that committee, and the former Supreme Court Justice Lynn is the chair of that committee. He was strongly behind it, thinking this is just great legislation, it'll go through easy. When I went up to give testimony when they had the hearing that was open to the public 2 or 3 weeks ago, it was very controversial. There were a lot of people there. I think the chair thought that, you know, there'd be 40 minutes of discussion and everything would be fine, there'd be a lot of support. It turned out after 2.5 hours, there was a lot of dissension, far more no's than yeses. Why
did he think this was going to be good legislation?
I don't know. I feel like it wasn't well vetted, the bill. And what they did is they conducted some research. They went out to the municipalities in the state and they asked them to respond to the burden of requests, etc. Well, I believe they only got around 30 responses, which was not very complete. And the legislation seemed to take hold based on the fact, particularly that out-of-state requests were coming in that were burdensome, and they wanted to address that. But as we dug more deeply into that, the bill sponsor said that happens rarely. So you have to be careful that you're not writing legislation to fix problems that really don't occur often or are not real problems.
Right.
And that is always...
Or that have some other agenda.
Right.
And that's clearly what's going on here.
You know, I honestly think now, as I watch this unfold, that there is a partisan agenda here that's driven around elections and what's going on. You know, when Kelly Ayotte ran for the U.S. Senate, and she was Attorney General. Somebody from California put in a right to know to get all of her decision records out of the AG's office.
Oh.
They literally closed down the AG's office for 2 days to fulfill that request. And they did it immediately. They closed it, they filled it, and they shipped the stuff. I think it went to a P.O. box. That was all part of politics. And I think some of that is happening within the state itself between the Democrat and Republican Party, which I hate to see. It's really a sign of how difficult politics has become.
Right.
And if you're writing legislation to deal with these more extreme positions, it knocks out your average citizen that's doing work to understand what their government's up to.
Right.
So I think that it's really unfortunate. New Hampshire has, our Constitution has language in it to protect and allow citizens, Part 1, Article 8, to open, accessible, accountable, and responsive government. That's a part of our Constitution. I believe we're the only state in the country that has that language within our Constitution. So what they're formulating now is interesting to me because I think you could have a constitutional challenge here. There are other states that have legislation and charge fees, but they also have a different process for remediating issues involving records, in that their state government, their Attorney General's office, and other divisions get involved with taking municipalities to court and addressing these issues involving records. In New Hampshire, our remedy is for the citizen or the individual to take whoever didn't respond to court and handle it yourself. And that's tough.
It's very hard.
It's so hard. It's so expensive. The Ombudsman office is open, but they're still working on rules making, and they're not tried and true. I haven't brought anything to the Ombudsman office because I feel like the city of Nashua is so difficult and so, frankly, untruthful about what they present that I don't want to throw that in the Ombudsman office. I don't want to burden it. I mean, our battles belong in a courtroom. I really believe that.
Yeah,
and
unfortunately, and that's where you have to settle these things, because the city of Nashua they're not forthcoming with information. They are hiding information. And it's very, very clear, and the efforts that you put in have revealed that.
Yes, very, very much so. And so the concept that our requests are burdensome, or they're faced with a lot of burdensome requests that form this legislation, it turns out with their survey, there's just not a lot of that. One of the gentlemen who spoke up at the hearing was a reporter for the Rochester Voice and another newspaper for a municipality up around Rochester, maybe 2 or 3 papers he covered. He lives across the border in Maine. And what happened is Rochester and other towns were refusing to fill his request because he's not a citizen of the state. And so, and he had always been a reporter. He had always covered this stuff. You know, he needs this for his articles. So he came in very opposed to legislation that's going to start bringing up a bill for him to get information, as well as the treatment he's getting now as a reporter to say, because you live across the border, 30 minutes away, you can no longer cover these towns in New Hampshire as a reporter. And he's right. That's wrong.
Yeah, sure. We have small states. It's not like you're living in New Hampshire and reporting in California. But even if you were, that would be okay.
Yes.
But we have small states, and you can easily, especially if you're reporting about Rochester.
Right.
Rochester's right next to the border.
If
it's
you're
a border town.
And somebody lives across the border.
Same here for Nashua.
Exactly. What if somebody from Massachusetts was writing something for Tingsboro, covering it? And we have the lady from Lowell Sun who writes articles and calls up here and gets information. She should be restricted and not be permitted to get information because she's reporting into the Lowell newspaper about Nashua news.
Yeah, and why are these municipalities so protective of the information anyway? Why is Nashua so protective? I mean, it just stands to reason that they're protective because they'd be embarrassed if the information got out.
That is true. I think that there's a lot that's happened. Laura Calhoun, who has worked with me on some of these right-to-know requests, she did an amazing amount of work to try and figure out why this loan for the Art Center, bond proceeds were converted to a $7.1 million loan by the city. The $7.1 million loan was given to a nonprofit set up by the city that in turn passed it to a for-profit company. the loan never ended up on the books. Now, she has 47 years of accounting experience. She started digging in March, I think, of 2023 last year. She started looking at this. We actually didn't realize that there were two $7.1 million loans. And all the research we had done, we thought there was only one. And then we discovered there were two. And she said this second loan was from the city to this nonprofit formed by the city that ultimately ended up in a public corporation. I want to get the records on that. It took her at least 15 right-to-knows going back and forth with the CFO from March until August to finally get an answer. And by August, the city had agreed to record or had taken action to record the loan on the books 29 months after they had taken the loan, and they were receiving interest payments on that loan. So now there's a classic case where Laura would be charged for that work because it would be the same right to know, and she'd be coming back on it with follow-up, follow-up, follow-up 15 times to get to the bottom of it.
All because the city doesn't want anyone to know what's going on.
And they never called her in. They never called her on the phone. They never offered to have a meeting to sit and be productive and look and talk about what she's looking for and what's going on. They allowed this type of dialogue to go on. Meanwhile, they put her in a database of all of her requests, very, time-consuming, and she's a retired senior citizen on a fixed income. She couldn't afford a $250 bill a month to have her responses answered.
And why should a citizen have to pay that anyway?
They shouldn't.
And who's got the stopwatch? The city has the stopwatch.
And have
again,
trouble.
we know that they weaponize these things. So they're going to say, yeah, we can answer that in 2 minutes, but why don't you make it an hour?
Well, it's funny. When I asked put in the right to know for the New Market Tax Credit emails in August of 2022, I got a response back saying we found 1,200 emails. I said, okay, you're not willing to talk to me, work with me. You didn't explain this federal program well. I want to see these emails. I want these emails to tell me a story on how this thing laid out. Well, the emails turned out to be a gold mine. They really did. But they were releasing them in batches. And that was okay. But I expected, based on past work that batches I had received, that I would have all of those records in 6 months. And the city, when they responded to me, said, we will keep you apprised of the completion date. Well, 6 months comes, and they don't apprise me of anything. So I write, and I say, hey, where are we in finishing this? Are we close to being done? Because I anticipate we should be at the end. Well, they write back to me and say, oh, we just discovered 1,800 more emails, and we're going to lay out a schedule. And they talked about how we're going to batch them at the same rate, except we're down a person, so it might be slower. And their batch rate, when they told me the number of attachments, was going to be almost 4 years. So, frustrated, I wrote a short 10-page petition to the court for a delay of records. I said, I want to talk about this. Because I also asked them to work with me, and on the attachments, don't review the attachments, just give me the base email. And if I start reading the attached titles and I think, and I know it's not a preliminary or a draft, because those don't have to be public until they're in final form. If I see a final form document I will let you know. But just give me the emails. Well, they wouldn't respond to my request to reduce the burden. They just let me sit there.
And you were trying to reduce the burden.
I was trying to. And the court did something that was super upsetting to me. They consolidated it. The judge consolidated into my big right to know case, which was taking essentially 20 months to get through trial. So all of a sudden, my quick petition that I felt like I should be in and out within 6 weeks or 2 months with it, and then get an answer a month later, was now pushed out a year and a half. So I just felt like I really had gotten hosed. And I don't like the way consolidation is happening. Well, I go to my trial in December. I have 3 days of a trial. I've got another 3 days to go through. And I'm sitting there as the judge is going to take up the delay of records, now it's going to be in April. Well, by the time he takes up the delay of records and issues the order, I've got 1 year left of this slogging production. The city would absolutely appeal to the Supreme Court if he rules in my favor. It's an automatic. And the production is over. So what's the point? I've missed my window to try and effectively get my records. So
Yeah.
I don't feel the courts are working with us the way they should, and they're not resourced the way they should. But finally, after another email to the city asking them to reduce the burden and not look at the attachments, they wrote to me and said, we have to study every attachment page for page because the attachments help us learn whether or not something in the email has to be redacted. And honestly, Dave, I feel a lot of that is bogus. I feel
sure
that
it
could
is.
be reduced. But when this legislation came to be on January 17th, I wrote to the city and said, can you tell me approximately how much it costs and what your estimate for the cost is to complete this job in the next year and a half? And I said, I'm asking because there's legislation that could come into effect very soon, and this would be a very expensive task, I believe. I didn't get a response. I got a response back from Hilliard, an attorney, saying, oh, don't write to her. You need to write to me, which I've always written to the city. He had never intervened. So I said, fine, you're on. And then a few days later, they sent me a new batch of emails. And I wrote back immediately and said, okay, here's batch 29. You just finished it. Could you give me an estimate on how much time it took? Because I just really want to understand what I would be facing for cost.
Right.
3 or 4 days later, the attorney, Hilliard, writes back and says, we will give you a response. I get a response yesterday on February 5th. And it was under RSA 91A, we're not required to answer questions, and as such, we won't respond to you. So,
So the response is we're not going to respond.
The response, and I waited, 20 days for that? 25
What do they
days?
have to hide?
Well, that's the thing. I mean,
What do they have to hide? It's just crazy.
work with me. And there's another, my Supreme Court victories that led to the city having to give me those emails off a backup tape. They're batching those out now. So I wrote last week and said, where do we stand on completing this? Today I open up an email that says under RSA 91A, we don't have to tell you. And we're not going to. We're just doing it the way we want to do it. Well, the real problem for me is if I want other emails and I want to submit a request, I want to know what they're backlogged with. I want to know what their workload is because I won't send something in and when work is going to be completed.
Right.
I have no idea.
Right.
So
They don't want you to know.
They don't work with you at all. And this city will run a bill up. I'm estimating that those new market tax credit emails, they would charge me $20,000 for those. And it's not right. It's just not right. I mean, and those emails have told me so much. I mean, they laid out the time frame of when this deal was done to take a public arts center and turn it into a private entity, which I have contended the whole time was never right.
It was not right. There's a lot of things that were done with that art center that were completely wrong. A lot of deception of the public, I think, and they have been deceitful. Where does that report stand right now?
Okay,
you
so
wanted to show some time ago we talked about that.
So, it's really interesting. It was up in the AG's office, and I had a conversation with the county attorney, John Coughlin, and it had moved to the AG's office. And just yesterday, I called to follow up because I had not been given a follow-up. And unsurprisingly, but yet disappointingly, I found out that the director on December 4th told his detective that it needed to go back to the county the county attorney. They never wrote me a letter. They never sent it back. They never communicated as far as I know. So I have a call into Attorney Coughlin, who I had a very productive phone call with in October of last year. He was on board, understood what was going on. He said he could investigate it, if not in Nashua, through his other office so that there wasn't a conflict. But he was going to call the AG's office and talk to them. So I kind of assumed that he was working with the AG's office. Now the AG's office says to me, it has to go to Attorney Coughlin. So
why can't the AG do anything about this?
what? Everyone seems to have a reason why they're non-responsive in this state. I really, really feel like systematically and systemically, there's so many broken systems here for citizens to access. We are just on our own. The courts are way overburdened. I mean, my judge who's handling my case, I found out has 8 murder trials to get through. How does that bode for my case? I need a judge who's smart and has time to address my case. And I feel like I definitely don't have a judge who has time. And that plays to the city. That's to the city's benefit, you know. So they love this burden system. I hate it. I feel like I don't get the proper adjudication. I mean, when I went and did my trial December 18th through 20th, one of the things that's required is that, you know, both parties have to swap exhibit books. And there's a rule. Exhibits have to be marked. The plaintiff uses numbers, Arabic numbers, and the defendants use alphabets, so that we know the distinction between both parties. And every exhibit has to be ID'd with either a letter or a number. When I went to court and to exchange books, I said to the judge, the defendants didn't ID them correctly. They used numbers. They used my ID, not theirs, and they're lawyers. I go, how is that possible? So he agreed with me, and he said, these are not marked properly. I want you to redo your books. Fast forward to the day that the judge sets up to mark IDs to go into the court 2 days before the trial. And the city comes in with like an index for me, a sheet of paper, no book. It turns out they gave me my exhibit book in a completely different format than the judge, the clerk, and theirs. Their books were ID'd and marked according to Westlaw rules for marking an exhibit book. A1, A2, A3, A4, B1, B2, all done, every exhibit labeled properly and indexed in a book. Mine was bait stamped with no ID number indexed that had to be cross-referenced to a separate table done by a clerk in the legal office. And why did they do that? To delay me, to give me a record that made it more difficult for me to work with in court, to slow me down and make it harder to find my records.
So they submitted the required documents to the court?
But not to me.
And
that is just dirty. And I told the judge, this is not how I get my books. The city in the past, and I brought in an example, has always labeled their exhibits A, B, C, D, E. Now I get a book that's not indexed at all, double-sided printed, bait stamped, but not referenced to a marking that's appropriate under the Westlaw rules for marking exhibits. And it was a game. It was a game. And it really...
What did the judge say?
He was quiet. And I was frustrated by that. You know, because... And what happened in court on day 3 is I asked the court to let me use their books. You know, give me your book because I can't move through this book. And also, and I think it was just serendipity. The Saturday before the trial's on a Monday. Saturday, I'm like, okay, I'm going to sit down with this exhibit book and try and figure out how they put this together. And the very first exhibit I flipped to, the table that was put together by the clerk, the name of the email was not correct. So, because there's bound to be errors. But it frustrated me because it made me say, how many of these are wrong? And is that really the right number? Or do I have a book that's not even put together correctly? And because of that, I went into court and said to the judge, I'm not accepting any of these exhibits as full. I will not accept them. And because they didn't give me a book like everyone else's, the second day of my trial, I went on the stand. And Attorney Hilliard had to walk me through every email to review and identify an ID and accept as full. We spent 6 hours doing that on day 2 of the trial. And I feel like it was a real waste, all because they wouldn't provide me a book, identified and marked the way the law requires them to provide me a book.
And the judge had that book.
And the judge had the book done properly. A matter of fact, when I was sitting up there on the bench to start looking at the exhibits, the judge pulled out his book and I said, that's not how my book looks. I don't have a book that looks like that at all. I can't track those exhibits and ID them the way you can. And he said, well, you can use ours. But that's not the point.
No, it's not the point. The city gave you something that to frustrate your efforts.
Exactly.
And that's why we have to have right-to-know laws.
That's exactly right.
It's ridiculous that they do this.
It was so burdensome and so irritating. And it's 5 lawyers against me. So
right.
5 lawyers have to play that dirty game, that dirty tricks game.
Yeah.
And
it is dirty tricks game.
I
have
was
so much to hide.
I was so upset.
Lacking in transparency.
I filed PCC complaints against both Bolton and Hilliard.
PCC?
Professional Conduct Committee complaints for doing what they did, because all they did was create a burden on me. You know,
and they created a burden on the court too,
and
because
they did on the court.
They don't have the time, and they wasted time. They wasted court time. Those 6 hours didn't have to be spent if they had just given you a copy of the book they already produced.
I would have been able to go through it and check it all very easily. And I felt like they were just making it so that I couldn't do that. And they submitted 250 exhibits. And the one thing the court had said to us is, I don't want duplicate exhibits, so I hope you're working together not to have duplicates. Well, I had originally in my suit 80 or 90 exhibits. They copied all my 90 into theirs, so they duplicated them. So there was no joint effort to work on that. I didn't realize they were going to do that, but they did, because that's the way they wanted to do their book. And I just feel like, they did everything they could. And when I was on the stand, they incorporated, there's a rule of evidence that says when you submit a document, it has to be in complete form. You can't just pull out a page or two. You've got to have the whole thing. And if you're going to break that rule, you have to apply a new rule called Rule 1006, which allows you to do an index and abbreviate it, but the other parties have to approve of that. When I started going through the city's book, they cut exhibits out to just bare pages of my comments, like 10 of them, without ever identifying that they were violating the rule. Had I not been sitting there going through them, I would have missed that. And I made them go and get them all and bring them in full form, because they wouldn't accept that from me.
No.
And I was careful with my exhibits to let them know that I was incorporating Rule 1006. I emailed the city and said, I'm using this rule. I let the court know on my exhibit list. I was very public about it. We came to an agreement, and off we went. And they operate with impunity and don't follow the rules. It's just not right.
Laurie, thanks for coming in. We're out of time. Time goes by really, really quickly here, but I really enjoy hearing about what's going on with your suits and with the city of Nashua and what they're doing really to the citizenry here. So thanks for coming in. We'll have to get back together and do part 2, because I know we have a lot to talk about. And folks, I want to thank you for tuning in. I'm David Schoneman, host on Perspectives. I'm here with Laurie Ortolano. We're finishing up what is really going to be just part 1 of a long discussion about what's going on right here in the city of Nashua. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.